Star Borg attempts to marry the heroic science fantasy of Star Wars with the grimdark, rules-light TTRPG philosophy of Mork Borg. Does it succeed? Find out today here on Adventure Night. I just recently bought Star Borg, and it's also a relatively new Mork Borg hack. It was only published in May of 2024. Now, a Mork Borg hack, for anyone who may be unfamiliar, just means that it is a new game using the rules laid out in the TTRPG Mork Borg, because they have an open game license which allows other game creators to use that rule system in their own way. These books were written by JP Kubert and Kyle Latino, who are both YouTubers. JP Kubert's account, I believe, is just JP Kubert, and then Kyle Latino can be found under MapCrow. There is also a solo rules zine, which is co-written by Perplexing Ruins. When you order Star Borg from JP Kubert's website, you will get 3 zines. You can get all of these zines for $30, or you can get just one of them for, I think, $12. You'll get the Rebel Handbook, the GM Guide, and then this solo rules one. And I want to start off by saying that the art is just fantastic, and the layout too. I mean, these books remind me actually a lot of the little Star Wars cartoons that I used to draw when I was a kid. And as an adult, I really have never been into like cartoony art styles. But JP Kubert kind of has been changing my mind about that. Even some of his other stuff that I've seen on his website really, piques my interest in a way that usually the very sort of cartoonish type caricature art doesn't. The art in these books are also just really evocative of Star Wars. I think that they give that really cool, grimy, sci-fi feel, but they're also very unique and they have their own flavor. Starting off with the Rebel Handbook, this book has useful end pages just like all the other Mork Borg hacks that I've seen, which means quick reference rules that you can find on the pages and you can even just sort of print out to have with you at the table for you and your players to reference. And I'm going to be honest, this title crawl page immediately got me as soon as I opened up the book. I looked at that and I saw it said, Star Borg, the stars are at war. I was like, oh, I'm so here for this. Save the galaxy or die trying. There's also a really clear character creation sequence that reminds me of the one in Pirate Borg, and also what I wish that the original Mork Borg had. In order to make a character in Star Borg, you're going to first roll for your bits and bobs. Now, bits in this game are the currency, and you either have them or you don't have them. And we'll talk a little bit more about bits later on. Bobs are weapons, clothes, and a trinket of some kind. And then your players may also have a ship, but that is up to discussion with the GM. There's not really a mechanical way for players to get a ship at the beginning of the game. There's no rolling to see whether you have it or not. That's something for the table to decide. You can choose a class or roll a class from 6 classes within the book. Unlike other Mork Borg hacks, there is no non-class option. If you're playing the game, you are playing with one of the 6 classes, but they're all really cool. The classes cover archetypes from Star Wars: smugglers, bounty hunters, droids, which in this game they call bots. There's a youngster class, which is slightly luckier than the others. And Jedi in this game are called Magi Knights, and whenever they use their Magi abilities, they have a chance of being discovered or alerting the Sith equivalent to their existence in the galaxy. Each class comes with a stat adjustment, items, and some abilities, as well as some flavor tables that you can roll on, and how to level with that class and what you get each time you level up. That's a really cool section. It's called When You Save the Galaxy, Pick One Option, and there's one of those for each of the 6 classes. To roll your stats, you're just going to do the standard 3d6 down the line that Mork Borg and a lot of other old school style games use. And you're also going to pick a galactic species. Now this is interesting because the other Mork Borg hacks that I've played do not have a race class equivalent like Dungeons & Dragons, but Star Borg does. Now, the race or the species in this game doesn't actually give you any mechanical effects, but it's kind of cool just to sort of role play which one you are. So you can be like the fish guys like Admiral Akbar, you can be the lizard people like Bosk. Of course, there's Ewoks and Jawas, regular humans, and a whole bunch of other things. I've even seen on DriveThru RPG there's some third-party content that adds a whole bunch more of these player races. Another thing you'll roll is your rebel motivation. Why your character became a rebel, it's sort of their adventurer origin story. Some are broad, and some are a little bit more adventure specific, which I can see running into some problems as you're playing the game where certain characters' backstory or rebel motivation ties to something that you aren't going to connect anything to in your story. However, if you want to use their rebel motivation tie-in to guide the story that you're going to come up with, then that could be a really good adventure seed. Next, the book goes on to talk about the core mechanics. There are 4 stats in the game, just like Mork Borg, except instead of toughness, that has been replaced with knowledge. So you have agility, knowledge, presence, and strength. And they all kind of do what you would expect them to do, but there is a reference in the book in case you're having trouble figuring out which modifier should get added to what type of action. Hit points for everyone are a d8 plus their strength modifier. Like in a lot of the other Mork Borg hacks, if you reach 0 HP, you don't die immediately. Instead, in this game, you become broken, and then you roll on a d4 table to see what kind of thing happens to you. So you could lose a limb, or fall unconscious for a few rounds, and of course there's a chance that you'll just die right away. Tests in the game use the standard d20 model, so you roll a d20 and then you add on or subtract whatever your modifier is to decide if you're going to beat a given DR or difficulty rating, which is determined by the GM. Fumbles in this game are called blunders, but they do pretty much the same thing. There's also crits, which are just called crits. And in the event of a fumble where you roll a 1 on the d20, something bad will happen to you. You could, allow an enemy to get a free attack on you. If you crit, however, you could potentially get an extra attack on an enemy if you're defending against them, or you might be able to do double damage when you hit them. Instead of omens, which were your way to sort of re-roll or adjust certain things within the game, we have destiny points, which function very similarly. Every single player gets D2 destiny points at the beginning of the day or after any long rest, except for the youngster who, as I mentioned, was a little bit luckier and gets D4. Combat in this game is all on this one-page spread, which is very easy to use, and that's actually something that I think is great about Star Borg versus some of the other Mork Borg hacks, is that the layout is really good and clear, and there's not a whole bunch of art that gets in the way of you reading the book. It's very easy to sift through, and the headings are, in yellow, or they'll be very bolded so that you could easily, I think, flip through the book while you're playing to figure out where you need to find a given rule or table. Like in the other hacks for Mork Borg, player-facing roles are the way to go, which means that almost all the time the players are going to be the ones rolling the dice, not the game master. To get initiative, you roll pretty much any die. An odd number means the enemies go first, an even number means the players go first. Melee, ranged, and thrown are the 3 types of attacks that you can do in this game, and they all use different skills. Armor works the same as it does as well. Damage is reduced by a given die, depending on what tier the armor has, and this can be decreased by a blunder on a defense roll, so your armor could actually get worse or be completely destroyed. Now, one thing that Star Borg has in it that no other Mork Borg hacks I've seen have is advantage and disadvantage. This is a D&D 5th edition mechanic in which you roll whatever die it is that you're rolling 2 times, and if you have advantage, you take the higher die, and if you have disadvantage, you take the lower die. This is used in this game for things like cover, so if you're sitting behind something, you have advantage on your defense rolls. But because it's not included in a lot of other Mork Borg type games, I'm not really sure how it would actually play in the system. I've always avoided it because of how numerically it just kind of throws off the math of the game. But to be honest, in these rules-like games, there's not a whole lot of grindy number crunching that's happening anyway, so maybe it's fine. When your character rests to regain hit points, you got the standard short rest for D4 and long rest for D6. But there's also something called medical bots, which can heal you up more, and they can also heal you in one of those big vats like Luke is in episode 5, where you can actually regain all of your hit points over the course of a week. And then here's something that's not super common in these types of Borg hacks either, is the ability to revive player characters. So after your player character dies, within a day, if you get them into one of those vats and pay all of the bits that your party has, you can revive them. Advancement and leveling works kind of like it does in the other games, where the GM sort of just decides when you've reached a point where all the players advance. Now, in this case, it's sort of implied that it should be when you save the galaxy, so probably at the end of a given adventure, if you're doing like a one-shot, or even if you're doing a campaign, at the end of that, you'll advance, you'll check your class, see what that gives you, and you'll also gain D6 hit points and increase 2 of your ability modifiers by 1. This is a lot better than in some of the other games where you actually have the opportunity to decrease your modifiers depending on how that shakes up. So it's possible that that's kind of just one of the ways that Star Borg kind of bridges the gap between the more super heroic type of antics that happen in Star Wars and the heroic or even non-heroic type of behavior that you'll get to see in Mork Borg hacks. For equipment, weapons have tags like reload or shoddy, which means that they break easier. And these are kind of like the weapon qualities that D&D 5e has, like finesse, which allows you to use a different stat for that weapon. Now, in this game, they're much simpler in concept, but it is an extra level of complexity that's been added to this game that other Mork Borg-like games don't typically have. Although in my previous video about Farewell to Arms Redux, we did see those as well. This is not quite as complex or quite as detrimental as that one, but it's a similar idea. Now, bits, which are your currency, can be spent in one of 2 ways. You either spend all the bits that your player character has, or you spend all the bits that your entire party has. There's no other option, and you do not tally or calculate how many bits you have in the game except to say that you either have them or you spent them. Now this is pretty cool because it means that you can sort of limit how much players can just go shopping for things, and you can really say, all right, well, you're at a spaceport, you want that particular laser gun, you got to spend all the bits you have to get it, and then you got to go right back out and start adventuring in order to make those bits back. If you want to get a really advanced module for your ship or a really cool thing for your party, then everyone can spend all of their bits in order to acquire that. And one last thing about equipment is that the gear in this book don't really have descriptions, so in many ways you're just going to have to kind of figure out what each of those items do, or make them up with your GM, which is cool, but just something to keep in mind. Now, no Star Wars game would be complete without ship-to-ship combat mechanics, and this game does have that as well. The mechanics for ship fighting in Star Borg are much simpler than the mechanics for ship fighting in Pirate Borg. Now, that game lets you be a little bit more complex about the way that you're playing those encounters, but Star Borg will allow you to just kind of jump in right away and not have to check the rules all that much. The way that it works is that ships don't have health. Instead, the players take damage when their specific station on the ship gets hit. And the station also determines what the players can even do during the ship's combat turn. Stations include being the pilot, or being a gunner, or an engineer, and depending on which station you decide to go to at the beginning of the fight determines what actions you have available to you while the fight is happening. Ships, like players, also can level up. They improve at the end of an adventure, when you save the galaxy. And you can get things like buffs to station actions, so like a new engineer action or a new pilot action. And you'll also get new abilities, things that the ship can just do. And then the last thing is just that there's a name generator on the last page of the book. Now let's talk about the GM Guide. Now the GM Guide for Star Borg focuses much more on adventure generation rather than additional rules, like things that only the GM would need to know. The end pages on this book are also pretty helpful. The front one has useful references like difficulty ratings and morale rules, and also equipment tags, which are those things that we were talking about, like bulky, reload, and shoddy. And then my absolute favorite thing that I've never seen in another RPG that I've picked up is the basic enemy template. This is basically a stat block for a generic type of enemy. There's a minion stat block and a leader stat block, which gives you a range of health as well as some weapons to choose from and some DRs that you can use to dodge those weapons. For a game that really seems like it's more designed to be come up with on the fly rather than run out of an adventure module, I think that that's perfect, because it means that as the GM, I could just flip open to the first page, take a look at the basic stat block, and then just kind of figure it out in my head while still having a framework to go off of, so I'm not just coming up with the whole thing from the ground up. For someone who's numerically challenged like I am, that is a great resource. Now, all throughout the book, you're going to find adventure starters and campaign hooks. There's some big campaign concepts that you can generate, as well as some smaller, like obstacles and things that you can throw into a current campaign if it's getting a little dull or if you just want to challenge your characters a bit. Now, the only rule that's in the GM guide is the rules for morale. And morale works the same way as it does in other Borg hacks and in a lot of rules-light OSR-style games. You roll 2d6. If you roll above the enemy's morale, then they run away. And you only do that roll if a certain situation has occurred. So they've lost 1/3 of their number, or a single enemy has lost half its health, stuff like that. There is also a sort of bestiary in here, so there's a bunch of enemy stat blocks for Legion soldiers and aliens and all sorts of other interesting things in the game that you can use as inspiration, or you can just use straight out of the book. There are also Dragoons, which are sort of a combination of Sith and also Inquisitors, so their purpose is sort of to hunt down and kill the Magi Knights, but they use some of the same powers very much like the Sith do. There are stats for giant, war machines like AT-ATs or AT-STs and stuff like that. And then there are a whole set of pages for scum and villainy, which include things like bounty hunters, space pirates, crime lords, as well as some cool new equipment that they can have as loot, and tables to determine the flavor of their villainy. There are also a few stat blocks for ships, not as many as I would like, but they have some fighters and they have some capital ships, so you get a little bit of a difference. And there's not really anything to explain how you create new ships. You kind of just have to figure that out on your own using the station descriptions in the Rebel Handbook and then some of the stat blocks in here. The last few pages are a Rebel mission generator, which is not super detailed, but it's enough to get you started. You could probably come up with a pretty good campaign hook to start off from just these tables alone, and then let your players kind of run with it and then just see where the campaign goes. Which is very much, as I've mentioned, the type of play that I think Star Borg really tries to push you towards. All right, the last book I'm going to talk about is the Star Borg Solo Rules, which has my personal favorite cover. Although I am not a solo gamer, so I can't really speak to whether this is a good solo game book or not. I am going to just sort of touch on a couple of things that are in it. First and foremost, it goes over rule adjustments and explains the solo play structure. So if you haven't played solo games before, I think this would probably be a pretty good primer to introduce you to that concept. One of the rule adjustments is that there's a unique D6 threat die, which is supposed to be a different color from all the rest of your dice, which you use to sort of ramp up a situation and increase the tension. And there's more random tables, of course, because that's a lot of how solo gaming works. But you could probably also use those tables for your multiplayer campaign if you feel like you've run out of things from the GM guide, or you just want something with a little bit more detail. All right. Those are the 3 books. Now I'm just going to talk about my thoughts about the whole game and about the presentation and all that sort of stuff before I close up. Now, I think there's no denying that this is cool. This is awesome. And in fact, the reason I bought it was just because I wandered onto JP Kuvert's website because I had heard him on Between Two Karens, which is an OSR podcast. And I thought, well, I'm curious. He had a lot of really interesting things to say on the podcast. I want to know what kind of work he's doing. And I was like, oh man, a Star Wars Mork Borg, and I pretty much just immediately hit purchase. The art, I think, just really captures my imagination, and it, brings me back to when I was really into Star Wars and when I was reading like the expanded universe novels and stuff back in 6th grade. Something about it just like awoke a Star Wars excitement in me that the sequel trilogy killed. Now, something that I've touched on a couple times during the video is that there's less content in here for running adventures and more for coming up with them. There's no introductory adventure like you get in the Mork Borg core rulebook, or a sandbox adventure like you get in the Pirate Borg core rulebook, which means that in order to start playing the game, you've got to do some work to create the situation yourself. Although if you do want an adventure written specifically for Star Borg. You can get one on JP Coovert's website as a, I think, $12 zine, or you can get PDFs of pretty much everything that he's created in the last few years by subscribing to his Patreon at a specific, I think, the $6 a month tier. Does the heroic fighting of sci-fi or Star Wars really fit with the gritty rules of Mork Borg? Well, I see it this way. Star Wars is probably grittier than you remember. I mean, in like the very first scene, they gun down a whole bunch of dudes in a hallway, and then later they blow up an entire planet and kill billions of people. The original trilogy, episodes 4, 5, and 6, also just have this very grimy vibe to them, which I think is awesome and is definitely absent from the other two trilogies. And in my opinion, plays really well into the Mork Borg style, if you're really leaning into that griminess. However, there's no doubt that you will have to adjust your expectations of how long your characters will live. It's kind of like if Luke pretty much immediately got shot in the chest after leaving Tatooine, and then someone else had to step up and become the hero of the story. It doesn't really feel like something that should be in Star Wars, and yet I think you'll be able to find ways to make that exciting and possibly even create more unique stories as a result. So with some rudimentary improv and some, relatively experienced GM skills, I think you could dive into this game right away. Everything is very well laid out. There are a lot of tools in there for generating adventure scenarios, and if nobody takes it, too seriously or gets too grindy about the rules, you could absolutely play for hours just rolling on random tables and coming up with stuff together with your players. Now, a number of simple adjustments could make the game less lethal if that's what you and your players want. Things like giving your players their maximum number of destiny points after each long rest instead of making them roll for them. That means that they could have a little bit more control over their fate while still keeping the game relatively dangerous. Or you could just make resurrection more easily accessible. So make it more cost-effective to put somebody in one of those tanks and get them revived for your players if they're really attached to the characters that they're playing and they want more of that Star Wars plot armor, the stormtroopers can't hit anything type of vibe. But those are my thoughts on Star Borg. I think that it's a really cool game. I'm honestly really excited to play it. So definitely I recommend giving it a look, see if the art inspires you the way that it inspired me, and also know that JP Coovert and Kyle Latino are both creators, independent creators in this space who are doing a lot of really interesting work, even beyond Star Borg, that you could check out as well. Now, as for me and my channel, please subscribe to Adventure Night and like this video if you enjoyed this content. I have not been uploading as consistently because I got married recently, and so I was a little busy with that. But I'm going to be back into making videos real soon, and hopefully I'll get the chance to talk about a lot of other cool books. You can see my shelf has grown. And if you have played Star Borg, or even if you just feel like you've got a sense of what it is from this video, leave a comment down below if you think that it accomplishes this marriage of these two relatively disparate things. I would love to hear what people think about that in the comments. And of course, once I get my friends around a table to play this game, I will absolutely make another video talking about how to prep your first session and what that kind of experience is like. So keep an eye out for that and more here on Adventure Night. Thanks for watching.